I know you'll find this hard to believe, but I swear what I'm about to tell you is the complete truth. I'm 72 years old, and I've spent nearly 50 years living alone in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. I've seen strange things during my time out here, but nothing prepared me for what happened last October when I discovered two infant Bigfoot creatures inside a collapsed limestone cave. I live by myself in a modest cabin deep within the forest, far from civilization. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, lies about 15 miles away down a dirt road that becomes impassable during heavy rains. I chose this isolated life years ago because I craved the solitude. My wife, Margaret, died 8 years ago after a long battle with cancer, and my two sons, Daniel and Robert, have their own lives in Seattle and Portland. They call regularly, worried about their aging father living alone, but I assure them I remain capable. The truth is, I prefer it this way. I have my daily routines. Each morning I walk through the woods. I maintain a vegetable garden during summer. I spend my evenings reading by lamplight or listening to the radio. The earthquake struck on a Thursday afternoon in late September. I was on my front porch drinking coffee and watching red-tailed hawks circling overhead when the ground beneath me began to tremble. Initially, I thought it was heavy machinery somewhere in the distance, but then the shaking intensified dramatically. The porch boards rattled. My coffee cup fell and shattered. The entire cabin groaned as if it were alive and in pain. I gripped my chair tightly, watching in disbelief as the trees surrounding my property swayed violently. Birds erupted from the branches in panicked clouds. In the distance, I heard the thunderous crash of falling timber. The earthquake lasted somewhere between 45 seconds and a full minute, though it seemed to stretch on forever. My heart hammered in my chest. When it finally stopped, the sudden stillness felt almost as unsettling as the earthquake itself. I sat there for several minutes, trying to calm down and gather my thoughts. I had experienced minor tremors before, but nothing approaching this magnitude. Once my hands stopped shaking, I began surveying the damage. The cabin appeared structurally sound. Some items had fallen from shelves inside, and I noticed a fresh crack along the stone foundation, but the building had weathered it well. The surrounding forest had not been so fortunate. Everywhere I looked, I saw destruction. Massive Douglas firs and cedars, some over 100 years old, had been uprooted and lay across the forest floor. Smaller trees had snapped in half. The ground itself had changed in subtle ways. There were new depressions and rises where the earth had settled differently. The familiar landscape had been transformed into something alien. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, listening to the cabin settle and creak. My mind kept returning to the earthquake, but I also found myself thinking about the limestone caves about 6 miles northwest of my cabin. I had discovered them years ago when I first bought this property. These caves had been formed over millennia by underground streams dissolving the soft stone. The main entrance was quite large, but there were countless smaller tunnels branching off into darkness. The Snoqualmie tribe had used them for shelter centuries ago, and during Prohibition, bootleggers had hidden moonshine operations there. More recently, they'd become popular with spelunkers until the county erected warning signs after someone got lost in the deeper tunnels. I had visited the caves numerous times over the years, always staying near the entrance. The thought occurred to me that the earthquake might have caused them to collapse. Limestone formations are notoriously unstable. What if someone had been inside when it happened? The possibility gnawed at me. I knew the chances were minimal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to check. By dawn, I had made my decision. I would hike out to the caves and assess the situation. At 72, I was aware of my physical limitations. 6 miles through rough terrain was challenging, especially with earthquake damage, but I had been walking these hills for decades. I knew every trail. After a hearty breakfast, I packed my backpack with water, food, a flashlight with extra batteries, rope, first aid kit, waterproof matches, and my knife. I dressed in layers and grabbed my walking stick, an oak staff I'd carved myself years ago. I locked the cabin and set out. The morning was beautiful, with clear skies and the scent of pine filling my lungs. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect for a hike. But as I made my way along the trails, the earthquake's destruction was impossible to ignore. Trees blocked paths I had walked hundreds of times, forcing me to find alternate routes. In some areas, the ground had shifted so dramatically I barely recognized familiar landmarks. A stream had been diverted by debris and now ran in a different direction. Progress was slower than anticipated. What should have been a 3-hour hike stretched into nearly 5 hours as I navigated obstacles. My knees ached from constant climbing over fallen logs. My shoulders grew sore from my backpack's weight. I stopped frequently to catch my breath and drink water. The sun climbed higher as I pressed onward. When I finally reached the caves around 2 in the afternoon, I was stunned by what I saw. The earthquake had done catastrophic damage. The main entrance had partially collapsed. A massive limestone slab had fallen across the opening, reducing it to a narrow gap, perhaps 3 feet high. Warning signs were buried under rubble. I stood there catching my breath when I heard it, a faint whimpering from inside the cave. My heart raced. Someone was trapped. I called out, but got no response, except that pitiful whimpering. I pulled out my flashlight and squeezed through the gap. Inside, the damage was even worse than I had imagined from the outside. The main chamber, which I remembered as being spacious and cathedral-like, was now filled with fallen rock and debris. Stalactites that had hung from the ceiling for thousands of years had broken off and lay shattered on the floor. Dust still hung in the air, making it difficult to breathe, and I had to pull my shirt up over my nose and mouth to filter it. I moved carefully, testing each step before putting my weight down, constantly scanning with my flashlight beam. The whimpering sound continued, echoing off the stone walls in a way that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact direction. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave, past where I would normally feel comfortable going. I crawled through a narrow passage, my backpack catching on the low ceiling and forcing me to remove it and push it ahead of me. My flashlight beam bounced off the walls, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. The passage opened up slightly, and I was able to crouch rather than crawl. Then I entered a small chamber, and what I saw there made me freeze in absolute shock and disbelief. There was a creature lying on the cave floor, and it was like nothing I had ever imagined seeing in my life. It was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, even lying down, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick reddish-brown hair, almost like fur but coarser, more like the hair on a gorilla or ape. Its chest was crushed beneath a massive boulder that must have fallen during the earthquake, and blood had pooled around it in a dark, spreading stain. The creature was clearly dying, its breathing shallow and labored, but its eyes were open and watching me. And those eyes held an intelligence that was absolutely unmistakable, a consciousness and awareness that I recognized immediately. This was no mere animal, this was a Bigfoot. An actual, real Bigfoot. And from the physical characteristics, it was clearly female. Then I heard the whimpering sound again, closer now, and I saw them. 2 tiny infants were huddled against their mother's body, trying desperately to nurse from her, seeking comfort and nourishment. They were small, maybe the size of large house cats or small dogs, covered in soft, downy, auburn-colored fur that was several shades lighter than their mother's dark coat. Their faces were strangely human-like, with flattened features, small noses, and large, dark eyes that seemed impossibly aware and intelligent for creatures so young. They looked at me with what I can only describe as fear mixed with desperate hope. The mother Bigfoot made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from deep in her chest. It wasn't threatening, despite her obvious pain. Her massive hand, easily the size of a dinner plate, moved slightly, weakly pushing the two infants toward me. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning. She was asking me to take them, to save them, to protect them. In that moment, looking into her dying eyes, I understood with perfect clarity what was happening. She knew she was dying. She knew she couldn't save herself, but she was desperately trying to save her babies, and she was entrusting them to me, a complete stranger of a completely different species. I knelt down beside her, tears streaming down my face, completely overwhelmed by the enormity of what I was witnessing. I reached out slowly and touched her massive hand, trying to convey through that simple contact that I understood, that I would protect them, that I would keep them safe. She made another sound, softer this time, almost like a sigh of profound relief. Her eyes held mine for a long moment, and I felt a connection that transcended language or species. Then her eyes slowly closed, her breathing stopped, and she was gone. She died knowing that her babies had a chance at survival. I sat there in the darkness of that cave chamber, my flashlight beam illuminating this impossible scene. And I wept openly. I wept for this magnificent creature who had just died. I wept for these tiny, helpless infants who had just lost their mother. I wept at the profound trust she had placed in me. The infants continued to whimper and nuzzle against their mother's body, not understanding that she was gone, still seeking the warmth and comfort they had always known. After several minutes, I pulled myself together. I knew I had to act quickly. I couldn't leave these infants here to die alongside their mother. I had made a promise, even if it had been a silent, wordless promise. I carefully gathered them up, one in each arm. They were surprisingly warm, their small bodies radiating heat. I wrapped them together in my jacket, creating a makeshift sling against my chest. They made soft, mewing sounds, almost like kittens, but they didn't struggle or try to escape. Perhaps they sensed somehow that I was trying to help them, or perhaps they were simply too weak and traumatized to fight. Getting out of the cave with the two infants was incredibly challenging. I had to move slowly and carefully, holding them securely against my chest with one arm while using my flashlight and walking stick with the other hand. I couldn't risk falling or dropping them. Every step had to be tested and measured. By the time I finally emerged back into daylight, squeezing through that narrow gap in the collapsed entrance, the sun was already starting to descend toward the western horizon. I had a 6-mile hike ahead of me in growing darkness, carrying two infant Bigfoot creatures. It seemed impossible, but I had no other choice. I couldn't stay here. The infants needed warmth, food, and proper shelter. The journey back to my cabin was without question the longest and most difficult of my entire life. My arms ached from carrying the infants and trying to keep them secure and warm. I stumbled frequently in the growing darkness, even with my flashlight, as the trail became harder and harder to see. Fallen trees that I had navigated around earlier in daylight became treacherous obstacles that I had to feel my way past. The infants whimpered constantly, clearly terrified and grieving for their mother, and I talked to them in a steady, soothing voice, even though I knew they couldn't possibly understand my words. I told them they would be okay, that I would take care of them, that they were safe now. I'm not sure if it helped them, but it helped me to keep talking, to maintain focus and determination. I finally reached my cabin well after midnight, absolutely exhausted, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. I brought the infants inside and gently laid them on my bed. They immediately huddled together, clinging to each other, shivering despite the relative warmth of the cabin. I realized they were probably in shock and possibly hypothermic as well. I needed to warm them up quickly. I built up the fire in the fireplace until it was roaring. Then I brought them close to it, wrapping them in several thick blankets. I tried to feed them warm milk from a bottle, hoping desperately that their digestive systems could handle it, that it wouldn't make them sick. At first, they refused completely, turning their heads away from the bottle. But eventually, driven by hunger, they began to drink, tentatively at first, then more eagerly. They fell asleep shortly after feeding, their tiny bodies finally relaxing, still wrapped in blankets and clinging to each other. I sat in my rocking chair watching them sleep, still unable to fully process or believe what had happened. I had two infant Bigfoot creatures in my cabin. I had witnessed the death of their mother. I had been entrusted with their care and survival. What was I going to do? I couldn't call the authorities or wildlife officials. If I did, they would take the infants away immediately. They would probably end up in some research facility or government laboratory, studied and experimented on, or perhaps in a zoo somewhere, put on display for curious crowds. I couldn't let that happen. I had made a promise to their dying mother, and I intended to keep it, no matter how difficult or impossible it might seem. Over the next several days, I learned to care for them through trial and error. I named them Riley and Morgan, choosing names that felt strong and appropriate. Riley, I determined, was slightly larger and seemed more adventurous and bold, with darker, almost chocolate-brown fur. Morgan was smaller, more cautious and careful, with lighter reddish-brown fur that caught the light beautifully. They needed constant attention, just like human infants would. They required feeding every few hours, around the clock. They needed warmth, comfort, and constant reassurance. I bottle-fed them with warm milk mixed with a little honey for extra nutrition. I held them when they cried, rocked them to sleep, kept them clean and dry. As the days turned into weeks, they began to grow at what seemed like an astonishing rate. Their coordination improved dramatically. They started exploring the cabin with endless curiosity, touching everything with their surprisingly dexterous fingers, investigating every corner and crevice. Their intelligence was obvious from the very start. They learned cause and effect relationships almost immediately. If they pushed a cup off the table, it would fall to the floor and make a noise. They would test this repeatedly, not just playing, but genuinely experimenting and learning about how the physical world worked. They understood that certain actions led to certain results. I began keeping a detailed journal, documenting everything about their growth and development, their weight measured on my bathroom scale, their behavior patterns, the sounds they made. Riley reached 5 pounds within the first month, while Morgan was just slightly behind at 4.5 pounds. They were growing significantly faster than human infants would, their bodies developing at an accelerated pace. They also started making sounds beyond simple whimpering and crying. Low, resonant hoots that seemed to vibrate in their chests, soft grunting sounds, clicking noises made with their tongues, chirping sounds that reminded me of birds. They seemed to be communicating with each other constantly, having what appeared to be actual conversations in their own language that I couldn't begin to understand. When Riley wanted something or was upset about something, Morgan would often respond with a specific sound or series of sounds, and Riley would either settle down contentedly or continue vocalizing until getting the desired response. They were talking to each other, sharing information and emotions. By their second month of life, they were walking upright on 2 legs, not with the wobbly, uncertain steps of human toddlers, but with confident, balanced strides. They could also drop down and move on all 4s with incredible speed and agility when they wanted to move quickly. They climbed absolutely everything in my cabin, scaling my bookcases, furniture, and even the log walls with ease, using their strong fingers and toes to find purchase on the smallest holds. I had to completely baby-proof my entire living space, removing anything fragile or potentially dangerous from their reach, securing anything that could fall and hurt them. Their diet expanded beyond just milk as they grew. I began introducing mashed fruits and vegetables, which they absolutely loved. Bananas, apples, sweet potatoes, carrots, peas, berries. They would eat almost anything I offered them. They also showed a strong interest in protein. They caught and ate beetles, spiders, and other insects they found in the cabin, popping them into their mouths like candy. I realized they were natural omnivores, designed to eat a wide variety of foods, probably anything they could find in the wild. When winter arrived in November, bringing the first substantial snowfall to the mountains, Riley and Morgan experienced snow for the first time, and their joy and wonder was absolutely infectious and heartwarming. They rolled in it, tasted it with their tongues, threw handfuls of it at each other in what appeared to be play. They seemed perfectly comfortable in the freezing temperatures, their thick fur providing excellent natural insulation. While I bundled up in my heavy winter coat, gloves and hat, they played outside for hours in just their natural covering, completely unbothered by the cold that would have given a human child hypothermia. I started actively teaching them practical wilderness survival skills, though I wasn't entirely sure they would ever need some of them. How to build and maintain a fire, selecting the right wood and keeping it fed. How to identify edible plants in the forest and distinguish them from poisonous ones. How to track animals by reading their footprints in the snow and understanding their patterns. How to find water sources. How to build shelters from natural materials. They absorbed everything I showed them with remarkable speed, their minds like sponges soaking up knowledge. They watched intently when I demonstrated something, then immediately tried to replicate it themselves. One evening in December, something truly remarkable happened that changed my entire understanding of what they were capable of. Riley was playing with some simple wooden blocks that I had carved as toys, stacking them and knocking them down, building different configurations. Suddenly, Riley paused and very deliberately arranged the blocks in a specific, intentional pattern. A perfect circle of blocks with a single block placed precisely in the center. Then Riley looked directly at me and vocalized a specific series of sounds while pointing at the block creation. The message and intention were absolutely clear. Riley wasn't just playing randomly. Riley was showing me something created deliberately, sharing an artistic creation with me, seeking my reaction and approval. This wasn't random play or accident. This was intentional communication, creative expression, perhaps even art. I sat down on the floor with both of them, tears running down my face once again. In that moment, I understood completely and finally. They weren't just intelligent animals. They weren't just clever primates. They were people in every meaningful sense. Different from humans, yes, with different bodies and different ways of thinking and communicating, but they were conscious, thinking, feeling beings with their own thoughts, emotions, creativity, and sense of self. They were people, and I was privileged to know them. As winter progressed into spring, Riley and Morgan continued their rapid growth. By their 6-month mark in March, Riley was already over 3 feet tall and weighed approximately 50 pounds. Morgan was very close behind in both height and weight. They were developing increasingly distinct personalities that became more pronounced every day. Riley was consistently bold, adventurous, and fearless, always pushing boundaries, always wanting to explore new things, always testing limits. Morgan was more thoughtful, cautious, and observational, preferring to watch carefully and assess situations before acting, but equally intelligent. Their vocalizations became progressively more complex and sophisticated. They had developed what I can only accurately describe as a genuine vocabulary, a real language. Specific sounds or combinations of sounds consistently meant specific things. One particular sound always meant water. A different sound always meant food. Other distinct sounds reliably indicated danger, curiosity, happiness, contentment, displeasure, or frustration. And crucially, they could combine these fundamental sounds in different sequences and patterns to create more complex meanings and express more sophisticated ideas. They were using symbolic language, one of the supposed hallmarks of human intelligence. I began taking them progressively deeper into the surrounding forest on our daily walks and excursions. They needed to learn how to survive in the wild, to understand the natural environment that would eventually, inevitably, become their permanent home. They learned how to find food in nature, identifying which plants were safe and nutritious to eat and which should be avoided. They learned how to track small game animals, reading signs in the forest. They learned how to build sleeping nests from branches, leaves, and moss, creating surprisingly comfortable and warm sleeping areas in protected locations. They learned which animals represented potential danger, like bears and cougars, and which could be safely observed or ignored. But despite spending more time outdoors and developing their wilderness skills, they always returned to the cabin before nightfall. They would seek out my company, clearly viewing me as family, as a parent figure. They'd curl up by the fireplace in the evening, and we would spend quiet time together. Sometimes I would read to them from my books, and they would listen with apparent interest and attention, even though I seriously doubted they understood the actual words. Other times we would simply sit together in comfortable, companionable silence. A small, strange family sharing space and warmth and affection. Summer arrived, and with it came new challenges and realities I could no longer avoid confronting. Riley and Morgan were growing so rapidly that they were now approaching 4 feet in height and weighed over 70 pounds each. They were simply becoming too large for the confines of my small cabin. They needed more space, more freedom to move and express themselves. I knew what was coming, what had to happen eventually. I knew that I would have to let them go, to release them back into the wild where they belonged. The thought absolutely broke my heart into pieces. Over the previous 9 months, they had become my family in every way that mattered. They had given my life renewed purpose and meaning at a time when I had thought my best and most significant years were long behind me. They had shown me that it's never too late for new experiences, for forming new deep connections, for discovering new kinds of love. But I also knew with certainty that keeping them confined near my cabin, dependent on me, was fundamentally selfish. They were wild creatures at their core, and they deserved to live wild, free lives. They needed to find others of their own kind, if such others existed in these mountains. They needed to live as they were naturally meant to live, not as curiosities or pets in my cabin. I began consciously and deliberately preparing them for eventual independence and life on their own. I took them on progressively longer trips and expeditions deeper into the wilderness, actively encouraging them to spend entire nights outside in the forest without returning to the cabin. They adapted to this quickly and naturally, their deep instincts guiding their behavior once I provided the initial framework and encouragement. They became increasingly proficient hunters and foragers, finding food efficiently. They learned to avoid areas where humans might venture, understanding instinctively that other humans represented potential danger to them. Yet despite their growing independence and wilderness skills, they always came back to me eventually, seeking out my presence and company, clearly still viewing me as family and wanting that connection. And I always welcomed them back with open arms, completely unable to turn them away or reject them, constantly postponing the inevitable final separation for another day, another week, another month. I told myself I was being thorough and responsible, making absolutely sure they were truly ready for complete independence. But the painful truth was simpler and more human. I wasn't ready to let them go. I couldn't bear the thought of never seeing them again. By October, exactly 1 year after I had discovered them crying beside their dying mother in that collapsed cave, Riley and Morgan had grown to over 5 feet in height and weighed close to 150 pounds each. They were nearly adult-sized now, though probably still young and not fully mature. I knew with absolute certainty that the time had finally come. I could no longer postpone or avoid the inevitable. I led them on a final journey deep into the wilderness. to an extremely remote area many miles from my cabin where I had heard occasional reports and stories of Bigfoot sightings over the years. If there were others of their kind anywhere in these mountains, this would be the most likely place. We camped together for 3 days and nights, and I taught them everything I could possibly think of that might help them survive and thrive. How to avoid hunters and hikers, recognizing the sounds and smells of humans from a distance. How to stay hidden and undetected. How to find shelter during the harshest winter storms that would inevitably come. How to find food when snow covered everything. On the third evening, as the sun was setting in brilliant oranges and purples behind the mountain peaks, I knew I absolutely had to say goodbye. I couldn't delay any longer. I sat with them beside our campfire, looking into their intelligent, aware eyes, these absolutely remarkable beings that I had raised from helpless, mewing infants into capable, strong young adults. I told them that I loved them, speaking the words clearly even though I knew they couldn't understand the specific English words. But I believe with all my heart that they understood the deep emotion and meaning behind the words, conveyed through my tone and expression. Riley reached out with one large, gentle hand and touched my face softly, then made a low, resonant vocalization that seemed filled with emotion. Morgan did exactly the same, touching my cheek gently and making a similar sound. Then they both stood up to their full height, looked at each other as if communicating something between themselves, and looked back at me one final time. Without any other sign or ceremony, they turned and walked steadily into the darkening forest, their forms gradually disappearing into the deepening shadows between the trees until I could no longer see them at all. I sat there alone by the fire, tears streaming freely down my face, feeling a profound sense of devastating loss, mixed paradoxically with deep pride. I had kept my promise to their dying mother. I had given them the absolute best start in life that I possibly could. I had prepared them as thoroughly as I knew how for the wildlife they were meant to live. They were ready. I had done everything I could. I stayed at that remote campsite for 2 more full days, hoping against hope that they might change their minds and return to me, but they didn't. They were truly gone now, living their own lives somewhere in these vast mountains, as they absolutely should be. It was right, even though it hurt more than I can adequately express. When people in Cedar Falls ask me if I'm lonely living out there by myself in that isolated cabin in the woods, I smile and honestly tell them no. Because I had Riley and Morgan in my life. I had the extraordinary, precious privilege of knowing them, of loving them, of raising them, of being a meaningful part of their lives during their first crucial year. That experience, that connection, that love, is more than most people ever get in an entire lifetime. And it is more than enough to sustain me for whatever time I have remaining.